this opportunity to come out and be a part of this, I think, first time type of event here in Stephenville. I'm excited to be able to connect with some of the people who are local, who have been kind of into this type of subject for a while, or maybe even have an idea about what happened over 20 years ago now. I know there's a lot of stuff going on out on the streets, so if you have to go, I don't mind at all, take your time, go check out everything else. It's really great store down the street, frames, I think. They have gloves and all kinds of really cool stuff too. I'm going to be giving a presentation here on some Texas UFO mysteries, the history of these encounters throughout the decades, a little bit of emphasis here on the Stephenville incident and lights and things that people have experienced over the years. But before I get into it, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Daniel Allen Jones. I'm from the Fort Worth area, actually from Crowley, if you're familiar with that, so south of Fort Worth. I'm a musician, that's my day job. I'm a music instructor, and that's something that I've been involved with for years, pretty much since I was in school. I'm also, as far as what I do in my media work, I have a platform called The Vortex, which we're actually live streaming on my YouTube channel right now. And I post all kinds of different things, interviews, on-location segments, and then presentations, a lot like what we're doing here today, and with other events like conferences that I've been involved with for a number of years as well. So I also participate in a number of other areas like citizen science and journalism, and I do study anthropology and archaeology as well, wildlife and nature and history enthusiasts. So there's all kinds of great stuff I'm interested in when it comes to the unexplained, but today's focus is going to be a little bit more about why we're having this type of fun ET festival here in Stephenville. There's my logo for the Vortex. As I said earlier, you can go check that out on YouTube and some other platforms. There I am with my bands. We tour all over the galaxy. We have a great time. It's just me here today, so I'm just going solo. But this is a group that I have on Facebook. It's called the Texas UFO Network. We've got over 5,000 people on there who share about sightings, reports, cases, events, other news, and things like that. So definitely check out the Texas UFO Network. And again, the title of today's talk is going to be Texas UFO Mysteries. Now, that is going to be something that can cover a wide range of issues. People still report things up until today, but what I'm going to focus on are the main highlights of what are more historical related reports and cases that have some notoriety, not just within this subculture of ufology, as some call it, but overall the things that are making the news. So we're going to get right into it. A lot of people ask about aliens, extraterrestrials. Obviously, there's a lot of really interesting ideas. Up until very recently, it's often been relegated to science fiction, but people have been talking about ideas of otherworldly beings for a very long time, at least over 100 years when it comes to the modern scope of things. People don't realize that it's well before the 50s that extraterrestrials were considered something part of reality. I also, being that I'm here a native Texan, I also get asked a lot about the chupacabra and what is going on with that. Is it an alien? Is it a hybrid? Is it some kind of unknown creature? There I am with my good friend colleague Ken Gerhardt. He's a world-renowned cryptozoologist. We've been on a few expeditions together. And there he is. He's a volunteer at the San Antonio Zoo. They have a really cool chupacabra exhibit. The Texas version is a little bit different than what most people think is this bipedal, hybrid, spined, lizard-like reptilian little creature, which was first noted in Puerto Rico in the 90s. The Texas version is a little bit more candid, like a dog, with mange. So people ask me about those type of things. I am very interested in strange animals, creatures, cryptids, cryptozoology, all of that fun stuff as well. But we're going to go take a little bit look back into history and take a journey through all of this stuff chronologically leading up to the modern time frame. So in the 1800s, people here in Texas and beyond were seeing things that they called things like airships or mystery lights. And Texas is no stranger to this. Back in 1878, a farmer in North Dallas, this was reported in the Distant Daily News, he saw what he described at first was the size of a small orange, and it got larger, and he describes this object of unknown origin as being the size and shape of a saucer, which is really interesting because we hear the modern nomenclature of flying saucer, which wouldn't come into being for another, over half a century later due to Kenneth Arnold, who was flying over Mount Rainier in Washington, who saw these crescent-shaped objects, 9 crescent-shaped objects, which he described as motions like saucers, which the media at the time spun into, he saw flying saucers, which is not actually what he said. But that's where we get that term, flying saucers. But here in Texas, we can claim stake to the coined use of the word saucer back in the 1800s, which is actually pretty interesting. It's a very real news article. It's posted on the University of North Texas's website as well. We also have Marfa, which have these really strange, mysterious lights. How many of you guys have ever been to Marfa, Texas before? You, that's very cool. So one of the interesting things that I think is really notable about the Marfa mystery lights is that it's not as far as I know, I think most people would probably say this as well, it's not a articulated craft. It's not some kind of vehicle that we know of. They're a light phenomenon. And some people relate that to orbs or even something paranormal. But this is what it looks like out at Mitchell Flat during the day. At night, it's very dark, and there's a historical marker out there. There's plaques, and he talks about, as you can see here, UFOs, aliens and UFOs, and other strange lights have been seen there. Earliest recording and reported history, this goes back to 1883, a guy named Robert Ellison, which is really important to think that this is just the first documented version of this account, not the first time anyone ever saw it. So people have been seeing these mystery lights since before there were cars and highways. So it can be attributed to lights coming by from vehicles because that's the only demonstrable or repeatable type of thing you can go do, which is what science demands. So anyone can go out there today, tonight, next week, next month, and probably see these lights, whereas most UFO encounters are only seen once, ever. And then some people say that they see them all the time. So there are a lot of other things. Here in Stephenville, we know that there was a flap, as it's called in ufology, a big UFO sighting back in 2008, made national news. But I've talked to people for years that said they're still seeing lights, they're still seeing things. They've asked law enforcement, they've asked military, some say they're just maneuvers, different things like that. But people still see things. In some instances, it's only a once-in-a-life type of opportunity that people ever have. But these are what some of the lights down in Marfa actually look like. And the top one are 4 lights, all moving in perfect synchronicity. This one seemed to split into 2, and this is the same light exposed over about a minute of footage that seemed to be changing colors. So I don't know if it was playing with the lighting and frequencies of my camera, or if it actually was, but you can see a sort of a dense inner core. And these could be the size of a vehicle or a basketball. They're way out in the desert. They're not like flying up in the sky. They're out, and you can see them illuminating the ground below. So mystery lights kind of inadvertently fall into UFOs or ufology because of the nature of them being somewhat aerial, which gets us into another area as well. So there's this thing called the Great Airship Mystery that took place in the late 1800s. And the Dallas Morning News, they reported the Great Aerial Wanderer, which on the 5th page, not even the front headline page, the 5th page, over a dozen airship reports all over the state. These were also seen in the Midwest and all throughout California. Now, granted, we do this now. People sell fake news. They did back then with tabloids. So even if 99% of all of these airship stories were completely hoaxed and made up to try to make some money, it's hard to discount that the concentrated number of reports in a given area throughout a very specific time frame would mean that it was all completely hoaxed. So I do think that there is something to the Great Airship Mystery. But one of the most notable, I would say, mind you, that the most well-known airship report is the airship story that came out of Aurora, Texas in 1897. Pretty interesting. Here's probably one of the only photographs ever of S.E. Hayden, who wrote an article titled "A Windmill Demolishes It." That took place on April 17th, 1897. This is 126 years ago. Where, how many of you guys have been to Aurora, Texas, or know about the Aurora legend? Few people. That's really cool because this is something I think is one that stands out from the other airships. Again, this is over 100 years ago. This is before the Wright brothers. Technically, nothing should have been up in the air. But this story doesn't just denote that there was some weird object up in the sky, but there was an explosion. This object crashed into a windmill. There was debris scattered everywhere, as the report says, and also that a body was recovered. The remains of the pilot, who was said to have been the only occupant on board. And enough, as it says here, enough of the original of the body was scattered up to determine that, as it reports, it was not an inhabitant of this world, which is kind of interesting for a paper to say that. It also says that he had hieroglyphic writing and that they buried the body in the local cemetery, which you can go to today and see the historical marker that says all this. It's 20 minutes northwest of Fort Worth. Really cool that they're able to have something just like Stephenville that we can openly acknowledge some interesting history that's a little bit lesser known, but I think still exciting enough to generate interest within the community, right? As I said, the Wright brothers, at Kitty Hawk came out with the flyer 6 years after Aurora, and most of those other airship stories when there wasn't supposed to be anything in the sky. So just kind of put things into perspective. We're going to jump a little bit ahead. Now, a buddy of mine, a noted researcher and author, Noe Torres, down in South Texas, has written a number of books on sightings of unknown objects dating back from the teens to the 20s into the 30s. Now, I highly recommend checking out his work. His name's Noe Torres, and that's why I wanted to leave out the up until the 30s. And most of modern ufology kind of is well known from the 40s, 50s, and onward. Those are sort of the heydays of where a lot of the different sightings really took place that we know of. So I'm going to go through this in history, where a lot of stuff here in Texas became noticed. This is another issue of Mystery Lights that got more notoriety in the 30s and 40s, but probably was seen before that. How many of you guys ever been to Bragg Road over north of Houston? No one. That's awesome. Go check out this 8-mile stretch of straight road. You got to drive pretty slow down. People have seen these ghost lights out there that they say could be some kind of haunting or some kind of paranormal activity, but they are some kind of aerial phenomenon. It's not way to the sky, but it's something that's luminous. It's a strange thing to kind of behold. I think I've seen one of them, but go check out what's called Ghost Road or Bragg Road. The Bragg Road lights, Saratoga light, has a few different names. It's another sort of historical group of concentrated reports out of the same area over a number of years. There it is. There's a light that I took a picture of. Now that could be a car. I don't think it was a car, but there are vehicles that we know we can see. So we have to be critical in our thinking and be objective in reporting. I think it's good to just make sure we're staying level-headed and not buying into just sensationalism or outright my views to totally, kind of getting into hysteria. So I think it's important to look at this in a way that's a little bit more critical. Another interesting thing, in 1945, I mentioned about the story of Aurora. A family by the name of Oates moved onto the property that had that windmill, which was connected to a well. In the original Aurora story, it said that the object crashed, exploded, and a lot of debris was thrown down the well, which is right there connected. It destroyed the judge's windmill, flower garden, and all of this. But a family that moved onto that judge's property wanted to use the well for drinking, and they took out a lot of debris that they didn't understand why it was there or what it was in order to use the well. So they brought that well debris out, and they used it, they cleaned it, they started a gas station a number of years later, and because of this issue, they had people coming onto the property to ask them about this strange incident that occurred back in 1897, and they didn't know anything about it, so they learned about it inadvertently through people coming onto the property. This is the front part where they had the gas station, and there today is some interesting stuff right where this building is and the sign and everything. So we'll get into that a little bit later on as well. But then they cleaned out the well in 1945 and started drinking from that well that the alleged crash of that airship, the spaceship is that they called the spaceman, flew in and crashed. They threw all that debris out somewhere. They used that well for drinking and starting in 1945. We'll see why that's important later on. Of course, most people know about Roswell. How many of you guys have been to Roswell, New Mexico before? Very cool. My buddy Chase over here, we just got back. We were involved with the Roswell Daily Record newspaper. The city hosts the annual event, which garners the attention of thousands of people from all across the world. Now, the newspaper is the first one to really kind of get a lot of notoriety because of this article talking about the Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer. There's that name again on ranch in Roswell region. Now, there was a lot of detracting coming out later on saying it was weather balloon and all that. So why I bring this up is because we all probably heard about this story. We think we know what happened. That's the interesting part. But then, the city today is full of, just like we see out here, alien stuff. Now, this is kind of a temporary fun thing in the festival right now. But it's like that year-round. And there's novelty shops, there's alien light posts. It's great. So everyone's probably seen in some way or another these pictures of these guys here holding up what looks like tinfoil. You guys have probably seen this before. Why I bring this up is not only is Roswell probably the most notable city, town, or place that's related to issues like this, aliens, UFOs, but these pictures were actually taken here in Fort Worth, Texas, at Carswell Army Airfield. That same year, just after this all happened, it was flown over here, and these guys were told to pose for the media to tell everyone that this was a weather balloon. This guy right here, Major Jesse Marcel, when he picked this up and he showed the world, he came back, told his family, and there's a whole saga to all of this. He says, whatever we were told to show here was definitely not what we had found out at that ranch. And here's Roger Ramey, General Roger Ramey is holding a piece of paper here. This is actually something that's really important in this subject called the Ramey Memo that people have tried to decipher. It talks about the capturing of a flying disc with victims and being sent to Fort Worth. So it's likely that whatever the real material was, whether it was this or not, was actually sent here to Texas back in 1947, along with, if you have a ship, it's very likely you might have bodies of some strange entity as well. So Roswell's a really interesting place. Even today, there's a lot of fun things that the city's doing. Now, in 49 years later, Killeen actually had a Fort Hood, or Canada back then, this nuclear site. They had objects coming over, and it was very noticeable, and they had been concerned that something was getting the attention of these objects, and it might have something to do with nuclear facilities or nuclear armaments. And that's really important in context of other people who have come forward at other sites. Air Force Captain Robert Solis, back in '67 at Malmstrom Air Force Base, and nuclear facility, actually had the same thing happen when they had UFOs come over and deactivate and modify some of their nuclear components, which is actually very scary, you know, and having something like that happen. So the nuclear connection is a very strange thing. In the 50s, a lot's going on, and more notably, one of these pictures, or all of these pictures actually, taken from scientists at the technical college there in Lubbock. And this has been featured. It was studied by the Air Force Investigation Project Blue Book, which they had some clips they were showing up there. These are the Lubbock lights. Some consider that these are all individual objects that had a big formation, and that, as you can see, some were not all together. And the conventional explanation, as it was written out to be, that these were just birds reflecting streetlights. You know, and maybe so. I find that incredibly unlikely, but not impossible. So I think it's really important to see that there's been a lot of detractors throughout the years, and the military themselves have downplayed the subject for decades, up until very recently. In '53, this is a really fun, sort of romanticized one. There was a story coming out of Houston about what they called the Batman. And no, not the Cape Crusader, and no, not this guy right here, although this is Ken Gerard, as I mentioned before. He studied a number of different encounters, flying humanoids and other strange creatures and unknown animals, and things like that. But one that where he lives and around the area where he is, he was asked to give a description of the accounts of what they described in the Houston Chronicle back in '53 of the unearthly Batman, who these people in the Houston Heights area went out on the balcony at night and saw this strange glowing form ascend up into the tree line and turn into the shape of a man wearing something dark to the effect of a paratrooper outfit, and was still glowing. The light that was glowing imploded in itself, and then a moment later something rocketed up into the sky. It's all documented here in the Houston Chronicle, and it happened in 1953. So interesting stuff. So UFOs aren't always just flying discs or flying saucers. Sometimes you have flying humanoids, flying strange things going on that we just don't exactly readily know. And I should say UFOs is a very subjective term, because you might see a UFO and know what it is, and you might see something and not know what it is. So, you know, to someone who doesn't know what a certain plane, even something very simple, it might not be known to someone else, but someone who's an aviation specialist might be able to identify this type of thing. So the term UFO itself is subjective. It doesn't outright mean alien spaceship. In 1955, it's said by Colonel Robert Willingham in the Air Force at the time that an object came over from West Texas and banked down south and crashed over the Texas-New Mexico border, which he witnessed and flew back in a private plane to go see this crashed debris, which he said that he landed, got out, and saw a huge crack in the hole. It was surrounded by the Mexican army at that time. He looked into this crack and saw two beings that did not look like humans like us. They had broomstick-like arms, large bulbous heads, dark eyes. Very common theme in some of these experiences that people describe with entities like this. Now, and say this, I should just share that these are accounts given, that I'm not necessarily ascribing for anyone to believe in this or to say that you should just take this at face value, but to say these are interesting stories that have been told by people of notable credibility, such as military personnel, and sometimes we place a little bit more weight on people who we trust with some of the most expensive technology that the U.S. owns. So that should say something. In 1957, a strange egg-like object, X-shaped object, I should say, very large actually, stopped vehicles, including law enforcement, back in Levelland, Texas in '57. It was glowing, it somehow stopped cars from moving and turning on, and when it left, they all came back on. So this actually was something that got written about very recently by another UFO investigator named Kevin Manning, the Levelland UFO. Also, in 1957, remember what I said about the Oates family? Well, Raleigh Oates, the patriarch of that family, actually decided to seal the well off for a number of reasons, because of something that they felt had happened to them while drinking that well water that had that crash debris in it for over 12 years. It's hard to see, but you can see O-A-T-E-S 1957. That's the seal of the well. In the 60s, a number of other things take place. One thing I'll mention in passing is that this year is the 60th anniversary of the passing of JFK, the assassination, I should say, because it's something unfortunate that had happened. But why I'm relating this to this particular topic is because 10 days prior to his assassination, President Kennedy wrote to the director of the CIA asking for any and all documents and information about UFOs be revealed and released immediately. Just 10 days before he was killed. Now, I'm not saying that this is why he was killed, but this is a real document, and I think it adds weight to this issue at an official capacity. In 65, this is a real photo that was taken by some law enforcement up in Sherman by the Red River up there by Oklahoma. Strange amorphous object that they saw. So we don't really know what some of these are, but not always particularly craft. 65 in Damon, some law enforcement saw a triangular object. This is kind of a neat little display that a buddy of mine made, but it just goes to show that UFOs aren't always circular or these discs, right? They can be triangular, which is actually a high statistic of sightings reported triangular shapes and other amorphous lights as well. In 1966, some workers from Dallas down in Edinburgh, Texas, had something strange explode in the sky over their work site in this caliche pit. I think we lost connection there. I don't know what's happening. So we'll pause right there for just a moment. I'll get this back on. And just give me one moment. Did our projector go into like sleep mode? Looks like. Does anyone work here? Oh, that's okay. It's all good. I hope you guys are, feeling great besides. It's really nice to hear outside. I just don't know if it
probably doesn't. We have battery in it.
The laptop looks like it's okay. The projector looks like it went in sleep mode.
No, what happened was it probably disconnected.
Yeah, go ahead.
Our internet is down up here.
How many guys, it's your first time to go to an event like this? So, most people here, that's really cool. I'm very hopeful that Stephenville and other towns like this start to acknowledge some of this lesser known history and embrace it in a way that does invite people from in and out of town to come and actually celebrate something that's actually, I think, pretty incredible. Yeah, it looks like you got it on, so. Oh, it's on, it's a extended display. There you go, yeah. All right. Thank you. Okay, so really quick backtracking. Those workers had something tremendous happen that scared them off, and there was a bunch of work equipment, including their dwelling and machinery, that got all burnt down. So sometimes being in close proximity to these unidentified objects can lead to physical effects, which happened here in 1966 down in Edinburgh, the southern tip of Texas, down by Brownville and Gallen. Going into the 70s, so I think this is a really important time frame. I want to just give a shout out to my buddy, the late Jim Mars, who I worked with a number of years. He was like a mentor to me, and he wrote for the Star-Telegram. He was a best-selling author of a number of books. He wrote about a lot of things, but he was writing for the Star-Telegram in the 70s about the Aurora airship encounter, because at that time, all those years later, people started coming forward and remembering that strange tale about that airship that crashed with the windmill and the alien in the grave and all these things. So people started descending upon Aurora. This one story made national news probably more than almost any other UFO story next to Roswell. People came from all over, and there was a lot going on when it came to Aurora in 70, specifically 73. But there, Jim was writing about this in the local newspaper. People came with metal detectors, and they wanted to dig up the grave. They found metal, which was taken to many different metallurgist labs, tested by people like at UNT, which said it had strange properties, high concentrations of aluminum and zinc, which was unusual for 1897. So some metal from these objects that had crashed or had some kind of, trace evidence have been tested and have been used in settings that are otherwise unknown to the public. So that's really important to keep in mind. The same year, Raleigh Oates and that family came forward and said, look, we drank from that well for 12 years. We sealed it up because, in his whereas he thought that they gave them really bad health problems, as you can see here in his hands, that he attributed to that spaceship crash and that alien that radiated the well. Now, I don't know that there are any medical records to substantiate his claims, which are pretty credible, but that's very unfortunate. It again reinforces the notion that people within close proximity to UAP or UFOs or some kind of encounter like this end up sometimes suffering physiological effects, unfortunately. This is the original headstone up in Aurora, obviously not there now, but this is kind of the size of what it looked like, very gnarly typical stone, not a typical traditional headstone. It's an 1800s Masonic cemetery, which is also still in use today. So it doesn't look like your typical headstone. Here it is. It had an engraving, which and Jim, who was on the scene at the time, suspected had, if you had the other half, if this was actually half of the original stone, it would look like this, and you had the form of a flag saucer or something with portholes. So kind of interesting idea, but unfortunately it was stolen. And because of the cemetery watch that was held, no one came into the cemetery, but after that was over, the headstone went missing and drill holes were found in the alleged grave of that alien. So unfortunately, that kind of put a halt on the original investigations, which now were 50 years ago in Aurora, which MUFON and other groups were a part of. In other news, and Blasios, a lot of the other interesting things kind of got attention, like in October that year, the mayor grants for landing of all UFOs. A few days later, a day later actually, a big red blob flies over a football game, and then they say it's the first annual UFO fly-in day. This is 50 years ago. It's pretty incredible. There's a newspaper about it. Another interesting thing that sort of tangentially relates to this subject of UFOs, what some people call ufology, is the idea that sometimes what we see in the sky is always mechanical. It could be organic or unknown animals, and in some cases, something that shouldn't really be up there, or at least what we think should be. And this is a tribute to the accounts known in South Texas now, down by the valley, almost 50 years ago now, what they call the Big Bird or the Thunderbird. Accounts of something that fits very similar descriptions of what we call a pteranodon or a pterosaur, basically a pterodactyl, which of course we're told went extinct 56 million years ago. Why are people like scientists, teachers, and other civilians seeing something of this orientation and this morphology in a place and time that we're told shouldn't ever be able to happen? And Brownsville, Ravenville, and San Antonio. Pretty interesting. And then of course, modern pterosaur sightings up until today as well. Very weird. So sometimes UFOs can be animals, as you can see. Here's one of the major reports. The teacher was about a big bird, so down in San Antonio, this is actually reported. There, my buddy is getting Gerhard. His first book was on the big bird, and sightings down here in the valley of South Texas. People were seeing something they couldn't tell what it was. It wasn't mechanical, but it was some kind of unknown animal. The same year, a historical marker was erected by the Texas Historical Commission that was submitted by Rosalie Gregg of the Wise County Historical Society. Aurora is in Wise County, Texas. And it does say here that the site is also well known because of the legend that the spaceship crashed here in 1897, and the pilot built the crash was buried here. You can go see the cemetery marker today. You can go see it applied. There's another stone. We'll get into that a little bit. Up into the 80s. Okay, so there's a really unfortunate issue that, again, playing on to the theme of being in close proximity to these objects, causes some severe things to happen. Now, this is kind of an artistic rendition of an object that was seen by two ladies and one of their grandsons, Betty Cash-Landrum and her grandson, Colby Landrum, in 1980. December of 1980, they saw this diamond-shaped glowing object descending on a country farm road north of Houston near Dayton. It's actually in Huffman. And it was surrounded by nearly 24 black helicopters, Chinooks and others that basically seemed to be escorting this object. Now, this glowing diamond-shaped craft was sputtering and shooting out light and flames coming down in front of them on the road. They couldn't go any further because of this object. The searing heat was so strong that they had to get out of the car and they felt like it was burning. And I really encapsulated all this very quickly, but there's so much more to the story. The whole convoy eventually goes off. They make their way home. The next day, their hair's falling out, they're throwing up, their skin's covered in blisters, obvious signs of bad radiation. They tried to sue the Air Force because they never at once at any point thought that this was an alien spaceship. Because of the context of the helicopters, they immediately assumed it was some kind of government military program craft or some experimental object. It very well could be. A lot of people come forward make claims about what this was and where it went, what it was doing. But very unfortunate because they never had any real assistance in that. And they since passed away. The only living witness is at the time a boy who's now about middle-aged, and that's Cash-Landrum. He doesn't really talk much about it. This is a picture I took of the exact location last year. So if you can imagine a giant glowing diamond coming down, spitting fire down the road, and there's 24 military helicopters. I mean, most people will never see more than a half dozen helicopters at once, not to mention 24, maybe an air show, maybe, but 24 black, unmarked military helicopters in one place with a strange object that, unfortunately got burned by is extremely eye-opening for anyone. Not to mention, this happened at the exact same time of the most famous UFO case in England, named after the place it was founded, the Rendlesham Forest incident, which at the same time, people halfway around the world were also in close proximity to an unknown object, which radiated them as well. So very strange coincidence, not anything else. Very synchronous. Another strange case down in NASA basically was written about and told to my buddy here, Nick Redford. And he's actually, well, he's originally from England, but he lives here in Arlington. He's lived here for a number of years. He's been all over different shows, written a number of books on many subjects, including UFOs. And he wrote about the story of what has become known as the NASA Gargoyle, where this guy, Frank Shaw, he worked at NASA down there at Space Center, and he would go out at night, go into his car, and look up at the top of the building and see this strange gargoyle-like creature perched at the top of the building with red eyes looking down at him as he would get to his car. He thought it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever experienced. And he never shared this with anybody, only his daughter, who related to Nick, which is why he knew to write about it. The guy never told anybody. He actually got, or told anybody else outside of professional capacity. The really important thing to note here is that when he did tell his commanding officers there that they said, oh, we know about this, that's actually why our guard dogs have been missing. And he was eventually interrogated by some strange men in black who came from some government agency, told him to pretty much shut up about it. Unfortunately, he didn't really feel very well about this strange thing that was seen down in NASA. What's a strange creature with long red eyes going down in NASA? It's wonder. At the same time, that year, a fun, kind of lighthearted movie, riding off the coattails of E.T. a few years earlier, came out about the Aurora encounter with the same name, where it's something to the effect of where you have a nice alien movie, they're not invaders, but we find out that the real bad guys are actually the humans that want to, keep us all under wraps and all this. So the movie's kind of fun to be filmed, so it's not really all that great. In E.T. is to go home, but not in Aurora encounter. We know that. So go watch this movie. It's online. It's on YouTube. In '88, a historical marker was also erected down in Marfa that talks about the unexplained phenomenon, which is pretty cool. You can go see that today. Into the 90s, Dallas guy built a landing pad, which made the news over in Hutchins. Pretty interesting. In '95, pilots are seeing objects in the Panhandle area in Bovina. And it just goes to demonstrate that we have very credible witnesses. It's not just some guy out by his barn, although that's perfectly fine too. You have really, prestigious people and professional positions that otherwise you're, putting your trust in with your life to fly objects, to handle equipment, machinery. Otherwise, why would they, for any reason, put their professional lives on the line to tell about a strange thing that they saw? So this has, I think, a lot of weight to when people like pilots, military witnesses come forward and open up about something really incredible like this. And following here, while in '97, it was the 50th anniversary of Roswell, and a number of people descended upon the town to have a good festival. It was also the 100th anniversary of Aurora and its whole incident, which there's the cemetery. Various news stations, including Fox, went over and did a whole special in a series called Encounters. They did the 100th anniversary of these types of things. Really important stuff. Coming up into the sort of modern time frame, in 2001, the city of Marfa erected its own viewing platform, this little observation deck, so you can see out miles into the desert from a few feet higher. It's a 24-hour rest stop with restrooms with little binoculars you can use. Very cool place. I highly recommend checking that out. In 2008, we all kind of have an idea about this whole situation as to why we're here, why we're having this really cool ET festival here in Stephenville. Here I took a picture of Steve Hudgens, Assistant Director at the time of MUFON in Texas, as well as Ken Cherry, the State Director, who I worked with for a number of years before he transitioned out of MUFON into a new group, which I worked with him on. He wrote this book called Stephenville UFO, which is a work of fiction, not because it was fake, but because he included things in there that were very sensitive and difficult to actually put outright without endangering certain people and their careers and their names and things like that. So you might have seen, if you were watching the truck TV out there, these guys were on there. Ken Cherry's a good piece of involved with a lot of these things as well, so I'm going to give a shout out to Ken in this work, not just with Stephenville, but with a number of other interesting investigative efforts. Now, one of the things I will mention about Ken, though, is that it's because of Ken that this town, and many others, I don't want to throw everyone else under the bus, but it's because of people like Ken Cherry, and we were talking with earlier about Angelina Joyer, and a number of other people who were here who were trying to make sense of this strange phenomenon that was going on, that people were experiencing, seeing, observing, and wanting to know and get answers to. These people were willing to try to ask those questions and tell the world. So Ken was on the news, he was at that big hearing, the press release, and this made national news and interest all around the world. People came out here, and from what I understand, other than the Levelland event and a few other small things, there's never really been a big, open, acknowledged effort, like a conference or something to kind of bring people in, almost like what we're doing here. So I'm very hopeful that this continues, because this was over 20 years ago now. It's really important we see that there are still people still alive, even here at the event, that saw these objects. It was described as being like a flying Walmart, a mile in length, going from horizon to horizon effortlessly, with F-16s sent out from the Naval Joint Facility, which they first denied. They sent out 2, then they sent out 4, 6, and up to 10 different jets, F-16s scrambled. They couldn't even keep up with this object, even with their afterburners on. This object was tracked, it's been seen on radar, and there's several different trace physical evidence to this issue. That's one of the things I think is really important for people to know. It wasn't just people seeing it, which is eyewitness testimony. You have it tracked on radar, which is hard physical data. And I think that with the combination of all of these things, along with eyewitness testimony, it builds a very compelling case that you could bring into a court of law and to a scientific lab, and I think do it justice, even after all these years. So I just want to bring attention to that, because not only that, my buddy Nate Riddle also wrote a book about it here, which I'll bring up as well, which he talks about it, and the number of likes. It's even featured in this UFO magazine, which I have here. There's a whole issue dealing with this. My buddy Jim Mars wrote an article for it here. The title says, "There's something weird going on in Stephenville-Texas right now," and it's some of the pictures that have been submitted by some of the locals and all these things here. Even, got some of the tinfoil hat, kind of like we've seen out here today. A lot of interesting things, but it's something we need to make sure that I think that we do what we can. So if you guys are local, let's keep this going. I think it's important that we have this regular type of function. So there's a lot we can say about Stephenville. I'm going to continue on for sake of time, and hopefully we can kind of make this a bit interactive toward the end. Leading up to the 2010s and on, I went with Jim Mars up to the city of Aurora, to the city council, and we met with the historical planning committee to start working on an event to commemorate the historical legend. That same year also there was an event called the Secret Space Program Conference down near Austin and Bastrop, which had a lot of interesting people come out. In 2016 I went to Del Rio, actually Langtree, but it's near the biggest areas of Del Rio, and we did some aerial footage of that object that was supposed to have crashed back in 1955, and using drone footage and topography, topographical maps, and sort of these coordinates, I went with other investigators, Noe Torres and others out there to try to pinpoint where this was. This seems to be kind of the area where this object came in and crashed. And all was said to have been confiscated by some agency, which seems very typical, unfortunately. There we are, myself, Ruben Durarte, North California MUFON director, Noe Torres, Garrett Holloway, drone operator, and his dad. There we are, and this is the Rio Grande Valley, historical marker, and then this side is Mexico, where the crash was way there. That same year, we also held the first and probably only ever Aurora Alien Encounter sold-out event. There's the banner, they had an official city logo with the windmill and the sort of flying saucer iconography. Although this is not really what was described, it's probably more easy to relate to than a weird airship or something, to that. And of course, the windmill as well is a little bit more recognizable than what would have probably been a derrick or a tower to some they had as well. They also have an official monument. Due to the success of the event that we held in 2016, they erected this monument, which you can go see today. There is Ned. Ned is the name affectionately given to the little dummy that the city admin at the time had. While she was a girl growing up in Aurora, she talked to one of the old-timers who worked at the cemetery, whose name was Ned, who would tell the kids about the whole story of the alien who crashed it and was buried in the cemetery. So she, when she became the city admin, was given this little alien dummy, and she called him Ned. He wore his Aurora City logo shirt, and she let me take him on tour. So we went all over the place. We went to Roswell, we went to Area 51, different places here in Texas. And I would fill up his shirt with buttons, and I would wheel him around in a wheelchair because he was in a bad wreck, So we had a good time. The following year, I held a tour and meetup there at the crash site and the grave site. About 100 people showed up. A Dallas lawyer came out offering a reward for the original headstone. That small kind of broken one that got stolen. The reward for finding that headstone or any of its whereabouts is $10,000. So if you know anything about that, Stratton Morris is that attorney in Dallas. A bunch of people out in the cemetery as well. There's my brother Matthew, he was there, he's here with us. We love to go out and have a good time at a lot of these events and functions where people get to learn about some of the lesser known aspects of Texas history. Fact, fiction, or folklore, I think it serves as an inspiration to how we can look into these things with an open mind and an open heart in a way that we can be willing to listen to hear people out. Some people have an incredible testimony or story, but because of the ridicule, it's hard for us to feel like we can share things even with our own friends and family. So I'm glad that we can have functions like this to bring people in and to hear about some of these incredible stories. Another interesting thing as far as when it comes to the government side of things, in 2018, NASA's SETI, and actually it hadn't been with NASA for a number of years, but the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence is still a very active program. There are a lot of different ways it's in use now. There was a grant offered for $10 million to help in aiding the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. For some of the people who have been involved, that's a pretty notable amount of money. I went out to the site as close as I could. There's a huge highway going all the way through it. The original Houston Heights location of that Batman issue now is a highway, but it would have been like right here where they saw this and rocketing up into that sky. It's the 65th anniversary back then. Now I guess it's the 70th or something anniversary this month. One of the things I want to bring up is that there's a number of shows, TV shows, radio shows, podcasts, online stuff, Coast to Coast AM. How many of you guys have ever heard this show on the radio or something late at night? It's like been on for years and years, different hosts and all that. In 2018, a scientist that was contracted for the Department of Defense working on these subjects, get explained basically, named Eric Davis, who's in Austin, by the way, came out and when asked by news correspondent and reporter George Knapp, if you were to place any bets on which of these were real, as far as crash retrievals, the retrieval of UFOs that have been crashed or down, which ones would you say? Well, Dr. Eric Davis said Roswell and probably Del Rio, which not a lot of people knew what he was talking about when he said Del Rio. A lot of people know Roswell, but Del Rio's that one that crashed, and that Air Force pilot got out and saw the cracked hole, saw the bodies that all got taken by the government. So it seems like if this is true, if this is an accurate statement by this Pentagon scientist, that we have probably a great amount of materials of unknown origin, or someone might know about it, back behind closed doors, and hopefully we can get this out to the public, because it would probably change so much, not just with our understanding that we're not alone, but that we would probably be able to change a lot of things with power, not like theoretical power or political power, but literal engineering and manufacturing technologies that could run on alternative energies and things that can actually help us in the world. So really important type of stuff going on. The Library of Dallas and the City of Dallas and their library asked us to hold a panel on disclosure and aliens and UFOs, which is really cool. And that actually is on our YouTube channel, The Vortex, as well. I went out to the site of that Cash-Landrum incident a few years back with MUFON. MUFON is the Mutual UFO Network. How many of you guys have ever heard of or seen of MUFON before? Most of us. So they're still around. It's not just in Texas, although being that we have so many different areas of Texas, there are a lot of regions which different chapters have to focus on. Submitting reports is a big part of how UFO operates, and we send out field investigators to go follow up with people's reports. We're not always sure what people are seeing, but I think it's good that there are civilian programs that can help with this type of process. Now MUFON and other groups are working with the government to try to make sense of the historical data as well as current and future data that can be assessed. 2019 Alien Con, which is the A&E and History Channel's big Comic-Con type thing for ancient aliens, and all these other really cool shows that they have now. Came to Dallas. I was featured on a few panels along with some other colleagues, and it's a huge event, and I hope that they can bring it back because it generates a lot of interest. I also interviewed a number of people in 2019, including Leslie King of the New York Times, who was writing about those articles. How many of you guys remember a few years ago, like the UFO issue started making the rounds on the news and on TV shows? This is one of the reasons why is because of people like Leslie King and this man right here. This is Lou Elizondo, who was reported to have been the director of a program called ATIP in the Pentagon. Who knows what ATIP stands for? It's an acronym. Anybody? Yeah, I kind of hear it. Yeah, so Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Now, it's a mouthful, right? The government has fun with these acronyms, these alphabet organizations. But he was said to have directed it. Now, there's still some controversy surrounding it, actually, but he actually might be testifying at the hearing on the 26th of this month, which I'll mention again here at the end. Coming up into our modern decade, so Ned, the other assistant chair, had his own beer called an Alien Ale up at a place they had up there called Martian Margaritas at the party patio called Area 114 off of Highway 114, which is kind of cool to think. The shop down there, the Frames shop, is kind of helping out with this whole event too. All of their books right now are like $3.77 because of Highway 377, right? So I think that whole tie into Texas history and location and things is really neat. So Area 114 was a really cool idea. That has since been closed down for a number of reasons. So I did a news report with Spectrum that year because they were interested in understanding what was going to happen a month later when the government came out with what they called a preliminary assessment for unidentified aerial phenomena, which is now referred to as UAP, which is the modern nomenclature or official version that the government uses for UFOs. We did this whole thing with the report there, which you can see on my YouTube channel as well. My buddy Danny Silva of the Silver Record is also a citizen journalist who's been covering this topic for a number of years. We looked into some of the things that this has basically turned into, not just a preliminary assessment, but it turned into the Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force, which has now become a big part of something right now that Congress and other NASA and academics are actually taking very seriously now. We also had another panel in Dallas about the same thing. Something really cool, Rice University down in Houston held what they call the Archives of the Impossible, which brought together issues of parapsychology, psychic phenomenon, mythology, interesting ideas, and cultural relevance all around the world, as well as UFO and entity encounters at this Archives of the Impossible, which they held a debut with the streamer submitting all of his archive to be stored there at Rice University. They had another event this year that they continue doing that. I highly recommend if you can, it's open to the public. Rice University has a really cool, very formal and fun event that's going to be coming up as well. And it's kind of like to get towards wrapping this up. Basically, there are a number of other events all around Texas. There had been way more over the years. Now there are just a few. But in Edinburgh, we had the 10th anniversary. Here we are at that Killeen pit site where those Dallas workers got scared off by something exploding up in the sky and burning all of their machinery. So we have these events going on. Last year, I held a live stream at the locations in Aurora for the 125th anniversary. I also announced that, we also had the first ever Texas UFO Con, which is like a convention like what we're doing now, but with speakers, including some of the others, as I mentioned earlier, Nick Redford and some other investigators and authors. That's going to happen again next month, actually, which I have some information on. So if you're interested in coming to more of these types of events, please let me know, and I'd be glad to help get you connected with resources. And also for the Aurora anniversary, I put together this digital artwork showcasing Ned and his terrific dramatic explosion into the windmill, the water tower as well. And here he is exploding into pieces. So So I have posters in this for anyone who's interested. And that's going to be and I should just say this, that's the cover to my book, which is about the history of the legend. So if you're familiar with the Lord story, you have anything you want to share about it, I'm glad to hear with you. To me, this is preservation of historical information in documents and reports and first-hand experiences that go back over 100 years. That's a big part about Texas history. And I want to just make a special mention to our friend Christina over here, who's with the Texas Folklore Society. This is a big part about why we learn about any of this stuff, is because people take the time to preserve history and fun information. So I'm glad we have representatives of those kinds of organizations here with us at this event today. I'm also glad to share that along with myself, my buddy Chase here, we are affiliated with the Roswell Daily Record newspaper. We just held that event back a few weeks ago, the annual festival. A lot of people came wondering about not just fun alien things, but about the history, about what we're doing today, and what sense we can make of these things that are happening now. And so that leads us to what's happening. There's a lot in the government that's going on, a lot in Congress that's actually just been going on. We're going to have congressional hearings later this month on the 26th. Speaking of the Roswell event, Chase and myself got to ask Congressman Tim Burchett, a sitting congressman, about this issue. He explains very much of the impression that the government has crashed objects of non-human origin, non-human technologies and materials that are in the possession of some of these programs that are locked behind doors, that they're trying to do what they can along with other senators and congressmen and women to make sense of how we can get this to be transparent. To provide transparency to the public is a big form of acknowledgement that goes beyond just saying that, sorry, we've been lied to you for the greater part of the century at this point, but here are the goods. That sounds pretty ambitious, but I'm hopeful, and I think many of us are, that is something we can all look to see today that happens. So other issues that we can look at that may have something to do with this, NASA is now looking at UFOs, and there are other organizations that are part of academic places like Harvard. Harvard has the Galileo Project, headed by Dr. Avi Loeb, that originally came onto the news about the object that came into the solar system a few years ago called Oumuamua. And so now he's looking into UFOs. He just finished up an expedition out to the Pacific Ocean to look into an object, an extrasolar object. Extrasolar means something that's beyond our solar system that came in and exploded over the Pacific Ocean near Papua New Guinea. And they used a machine to go down exploring the seafloor and discover these small metal objects of extraterrestrial, in the literal sense, extraterrestrial origin. Now, is it extraterrestrial technology? We don't know, but that's what they're interested in studying. So we have actual scientists, academics, government organizations, NASA, and Congress all on board to try to make sense of something which has otherwise been laughed at for decades. This is such an exciting and important time that people, I think, should feel a lot more open to the possibility that not only are we alone, or not alone, I should say, but that we probably have a lot of things that unfortunately have been withheld from us for over 3/4 of a century now. And with that being said, I'm interested to hear what you guys think about a lot of these things. But before I wrap this up, I know we have one or two more things on here I just want to show really quick, and I'll just mix it out and see if I can come back to it on. Oh, there we go. Okay. So again, there's a lot happening. It makes us wonder what's going to take place, not just later this year, but literally later this month. There could be some incredibly overwhelming things being shared by people like Lou Elizondo, David Garach, and others who are going to testify before Congress. And I think that whether it's them or whether it's someone completely unknown, it's important to hear them out, to be considerate about their claims, but to also remember that they are just claims. To not believe them just because they're saying. We need to see the physical evidence for anything in this field to be moved forward, I think. People will believe what they want to either way, but it's really important that we see that if people in the government and military were to claim that we have alien spaceships, and then not only do we have their spaceships, technology, debris, crashed retrievals, but that we also have bodies, and maybe not just dead aliens, but that we also have alive ones potentially as well. That's incredibly exciting for science, and I think it's really important to see that that we have, if we do have this stuff, that needs to be shown, it needs to be given to the world at large, because we deserve it. The scientists who thought this is all nonsense for years deserve it, because they're the ones who need to be able to look at it and say, wow, this is... So what I encourage all of you to do, again, is to keep an open mind, to see that there are other events, like what we're doing here now, in Edinburgh and other places, like in Jefferson, and other places around Texas that you can go and check out. This is happening as well. And if you're not always able to get out to places, I like to do what I can to share about that through the media work that I do with the Cortex and other things like the Texas UFO Network, which again, you can share about sightings that you have had or you're interested in learning about. Also have other resources. So with that, I just want to thank you guys for your time to come out here. And again, it's really a great honor to be here for the first of its kind ET Festival here at Stephenville. So I really appreciate your time coming out. So thank you so much.